Her fingers fumbled frantically against the polished wood, trying to turn the handle. But the heavy steel bolt of the office
그래도 그
door
여자랑
had
같이
already
살려고
slammed
했어.
home with a mechanical thud. Click. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as the realization washed over her. She wasn't free. "You thought I was saving you," the man's voice whispered from the darkness, low and terrifyingly calm. "But I was just collecting a debt." She turned slowly, her back pressed against the locked door, her eyes wide with primal fear. But the man standing by the rain-lashed window was no longer the strict boss she had brought coffee to. He was the judge. The single photograph he slid across the desk didn't just reveal her secret, it signed her death warrant. It is a torrential midnight in the city present day. And the executive suite of The Monolith was usually a place of quiet, high-stakes architecture where billionaires signed contracts for skyscrapers over scotch and handshakes. This wasn't just an office. This was Hyun Yu Song's kingdom. Every security guard knew the protocol. Every camera angle was calibrated to his specifications. You didn't enter unless invited. You didn't leave unless dismissed. And you never ever lied to the man in the corner office. Hyun Yu stood by his desk, a silhouette of immaculate tailoring and cold restraint. He didn't pace. He didn't yell. At 34, he possessed the kind of stillness that made other men nervous, the stillness of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. His dark eyes missed nothing. His memory was a vault. And tonight, he wasn't looking at blueprints or profit margins. He was looking at the woman trembling against his door. This was how Hyun Yu operated. He gathered facts. He assessed value. He removed liabilities with surgical precision. He had rebuilt his family's legacy from the ashes because he understood one fundamental truth. Forgiveness was a defect, and defects got you destroyed. But the woman in his office had tested that truth. She thought she had escaped the monster who fathered her. She thought she had found a sanctuary in the glass walls of this tower. She was wrong. She hadn't run into a safe house. She had run straight into the lion's den. And as Hyun Yu crossed his arms, his face unreadable and hard as stone, she realized the terrifying reality. The stalker outside was the least of her problems. The real danger was the man who had just locked her in. The echo of the magnetic lock died away, but the silence that followed was heavier than the steel door itself. The office, usually a cathedral of light and air, felt suddenly subterranean. The automated blinds had turned the room into a gray twilight, illuminated only by the faint, clinical glow of the desk lamp. Melissa stood paralyzed, her back pressed against the wood, her hands still hovering over the useless handle. The coffee she had placed on the desk sent a thin spiral of steam into the stagnant air, a fragile sign of the normalcy that had just been shattered. Hyun Yu didn't move toward her. Not yet. He stood by the window, staring at the slats of the blinds as if he could see the rain-slicked city through the metal. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried across the room with the precision of a scalpel. January 14, 2011. He turned slowly, his face a mask of terrifying neutrality. He picked up the photograph from the desk, the image of the girl in the silk dress, and studied it. It was snowing that night in Incheon, he continued, his tone conversational, as if reciting a weather report. The accelerant was poured through the ventilation system first. They say the smoke kills you before the heat does. I have always hoped that was true, because my mother was screaming until the roof collapsed. Melissa's breath hitched, a ragged sound in the quiet. She knew the story. Everyone in the underworld knew the story of the Song family massacre. But hearing it from the survivor in this room stripped away the history and left only the horror. "Your father ordered that fire," Hyun Yu said. He looked up from the photo, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Chairman Yang signed the check that bought the gasoline. He eliminated his competition so he could expand his territory, so he could buy more ships, so he could buy a bigger house. He took a step toward her, then another. The distance between them closed, suffocating her. "And where were you, Jong Mi?" He used her birth name like a curse. "While my parents burned, were you sitting in that velvet chair? Were you at a private school in Switzerland, safe and warm?" He stopped inches from her. She could smell the expensive cologne he wore, a scent that now smelled like ice. He reached out, not to touch her, but to brace his hand against the door next to her head, trapping her. "Did the silk dresses feel soft against your skin?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "Oh, did the champagne taste sweet? Or did you taste the ash every time you spent $1 of his money?" Melissa didn't flinch this time. The proximity of his body, the heat radiating from him, the suffocating scent of his judgment. It was all terrifying, yes, but the accusation ignited something else. A cold, hard spark of indignation that burned through the fear. She didn't beg for her life. She didn't drop to her knees or weep for forgiveness. Instead, she looked up, meeting his black eyes with a gaze that was trembling but unbroken. "Switzerland," she repeated, her voice hoarse but audible. "You think he sent me to boarding school?" She let out a dry, broken laugh that sounded more like a cough. "My father didn't believe in education for women. He believed in obedience, and he believed that assets should be kept in the vault." Slowly, deliberately, she moved her hands. Hyun-Yu watched her, his body tense, ready to intercept a weapon. But she didn't reach for the letter opener or the heavy stapler. She reached for her own left wrist. Her fingers were shaking so badly it took her 2 tries to undo the pearl button of her blouse cuff. The fabric parted. She rolled up the sleeve, exposing the pale, delicate skin of her forearm. Hyun-Yu's eyes dropped to the limb. He didn't want to look, but the visual was commanding. There was no silk there. Running from her wrist halfway to her elbow was a jagged, raised keloid scar. It was ugly, white, and twisted, the kind of mark left not by an accident, but by shattered glass ground into flesh and left to heal without a doctor. "I was 12, she whispered. "I dropped a bottle of his scotch. That was the price." She held her arm out, forcing him to see the map of her childhood. "You asked if the champagne tasted sweet. I wouldn't know. I wasn't allowed at the table. I was kept in the basement until I was useful enough to be married off to a cartel head twice my age." She rolled the sleeve down, fumbling to rebutton it, shielding the ugly truth of her pedigree. She looked back at Hyun-Yu, her eyes wet but fierce. "I didn't run to spend his money, Mr. Song," she said, her voice steadying into a blade of its own. "I didn't run to hide from the police or to live in luxury. I ran because I knew that if I stayed one more night under his roof, I would be carried out in a bag." She pressed her back against the door, the distance between them filled with the ghosts of their shared trauma. "So go ahead. Kill me for being his daughter. But don't you dare tell me I enjoyed it." The silence in the room shifted. It lost its jagged edge of accusation and settled into something colder, sharper, the clinical detachment of an appraisal. Hyun-Yu didn't step back. He didn't apologize for the history he had dredged up. Instead, he moved closer, eroding the last few inches of space between them until his shadow completely swallowed hers. Melissa pressed her spine against the wood of the door, her breath shallow and rapid, like a bird trapped in a vent. He reached out. Melissa's instinct was to recoil, a reflex honed by years of surviving a violent household, but there was nowhere to go. His hand didn't strike. It captured. His fingers wrapped around her chin, his grip firm and inescapable, tilting her face up to the dim light. "Look at me," he commanded. It wasn't a request for connection. It was an order for inspection. He stared into her eyes with a terrifying intensity, searching the dilated pupils for the flicker of a lie. He was looking for the shifting gaze of a manipulator, the arrogant defiance of a spoiled heiress. But all he saw was the raw, unvarnished terror of a woman who expected pain. His thumb brushed against her jawline, not in a caress, but feeling the tension in the muscle. He moved his other hand to her neck, pressing his fingers against the carotid artery. Melissa gasped, her body going rigid, but she didn't fight him. She let him take her measure. He felt the pulse hammering against his fingertips. Fast, erratic, thundering. It was the heartbeat of prey, honest in its panic. A liar's pulse would steady as they constructed a narrative. Hers was wild, chaotic, high and desperately real. He traced the line of her throat, his touch possessing the dispassionate curiosity of a buyer inspecting a damaged antique. He was looking for cracks in the porcelain. He found them everywhere. The way she held her breath, the tremor in her lower lip, the scar hidden beneath the silk of her blouse. She wasn't a viper in the grass. She was something else entirely. She was wreckage. "You are terrified," he murmured, his voice low enough to vibrate in the air between them. "But not of me." "I am terrified of everything," she whispered back, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. Yunyu held her gaze for a second longer, his dark eyes stripping away the layers of her defense. He had spent 15 years hating a name, building a monument of rage against the Yang bloodline. But the woman trembling under his hand didn't feel like an enemy. She felt like a mirror. He released her abruptly, stepping back as if her skin burned him. The assessment was complete. The verdict hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. She was telling the truth. And that made everything infinitely more complicated. The fragile silence that had settled over the room shattered with a single, harsh sound. Bzzzt. The secure intercom on the mahogany desk flared to life, its red light blinking with an urgency that cut through the emotional haze like a siren. Yonyu turned away from Melissa, the predator's focus instantly shifting from the woman to the machine. He pressed the button, his movement sharp and precise. "Report," he commanded. "Sir?" Mr. Park's voice came through, stripped of its usual calm and replaced by a tight, clipped tension. "No, sir, we have a situation at the plaza level. 4 vehicles just breached the perimeter. Black SUVs, tinted windows, no license plates." Melissa let out a small, strangled sound, a whimper that died in her throat. Her hands flew to her mouth as she backed away from the desk, her eyes wide with a recognition that was absolute and terrifying. She didn't need to see the cars to know who was inside them. Yunyu didn't look at her. He walked to the wall of monitors concealed behind a panel of oak paneling and engaged the security feed. The screens flickered to life, showing the rain-slicked entrance of the monolith. There they were, 4 massive black vehicles idling at the curb like hearses waiting for a body. They sat heavy on their suspension, engine lights cutting through the downpour. The doors of the lead car opened and men stepped out. And they weren't police, and they weren't street thugs. They wore identical charcoal raincoats and moved with the synchronized, lethal efficiency of a hit squad. "The cleaners," Melissa whispered, the word trembling in the air. "My father sent the cleaners." Hyun-Yu watched the screen, his jaw tightening. He recognized the formation. This wasn't a negotiation team. This was a retrieval unit. The Zhang Syndicate didn't send men like this to talk. They sent them to scrub a mess until no trace remained. "They are setting up a perimeter," Park continued over the link. "They haven't drawn weapons yet, but they are blocking the exits. Sir, they are armed heavily. If they try to breach the lobby glass—" "Hold the line, Park," Yun-Yu ordered, his voice icy. "Lock down the elevators. No one comes up. No one goes down. I'm an initiate protocol 0. "Understood." The line went dead. Yan-Yu stared at the monitors for a second longer, watching the men below move like sharks circling a reef. They had surrounded his fortress. They had trespassed on his land, and they had done it for the woman shivering against his office door. He turned back to Melissa. The inspection was over. The war had arrived. Her father hadn't just come for his daughter. He had brought an army to Yan-Yu's doorstep, daring him to do something about it. The monolith was no longer just an office building. It was a siege tower. Yan-Yu turned away from the bank of monitors, the blue light of the screens casting long, jagged shadows across his face. He looked at Melissa, who was pressed against the far wall as if trying to merge with the plaster. The panic in the room was palpable. Oh, a living thing that tasted of copper and adrenaline. "You know their protocol," Yan-Yu said, his voice terrifyingly calm amidst the mounting chaos. "They aren't here to assassinate you, Jiang Mi. If they wanted you dead, a sniper would have taken the shot through the lobby glass 5 minutes ago." He walked toward her, stopping at the edge of the desk. "They are here to retrieve property. They will put you in the car. They will drive you back to the estate. Your father will likely lock you in the basement for a month to teach you a lesson, perhaps add another scar to match the one on your arm, and then he will marry you off to the highest bidder to secure his southern shipping routes." Melissa made a sound, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like a sob. The reality he painted was not a threat. It was a memory. She knew exactly what home looked like. It looked like a cage with silk sheets. That is option one, Hyun-Yu stated, his dark eyes boring into hers. I send you down. I tell my security to stand down. You walk out the front door, and this war ends before it begins. You live, you survive. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. He leaned forward slightly, resting his knuckles on the desk. Or, he said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. You stay. Melissa looked up, her eyes wide and wet. Stay. I can lock this building down, Hyun-Yu continued. I can turn the monolith into a fortress that your father's men cannot breach without an airstrike. I can keep you safe from him. Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered in her expression, but Hyun-Yu crushed it instantly. I know what, but understand this, he warned, his gaze hardening into steel. I am not a charity. I am not a knight. If I start a war with the Yang Syndicate to keep you, you cease to be a free woman. You do not leave this building. You do not make decisions. You do not have a life outside of these walls. He stepped around the desk, closing the distance until he was looming over her, a dark, overwhelming force of nature. If you go down there, you belong to your father, he whispered, the ultimatum hanging heavy in the air. But if you stay here, you belong to me. The rain lashed against the glass with renewed violence, blurring the city lights into streaks of sickly yellow and bruised purple. Melissa turned her head toward the window, looking down into the abyss where the black SUVs waited. She couldn't see them from this height, but she could feel them. They were a gravitational force pulling her back toward a black hole she had spent 10 years trying to escape. She knew exactly what waited for her in the back of those cars. It wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a needle in the neck, a hood over the head, and a waking nightmare in the soundproof basement of the Yang estate. Her father didn't forgive. He corrected, and his corrections left marks that never faded. She looked back at Hyun-Yu. He was a statue carved from shadow and resentment. He stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of indifference that barely concealed the hatred burning behind his eyes. He had just told her, in plain language, that he intended to imprison her. He had stripped away her freedom, her agency, and her name. He was a monster, but he was a monster who had stopped. He was a monster who had looked at her scar and seen pain, not failure. Her father was fire, consuming, chaotic, inevitable. Hyun-Yu was ice, hard, unyielding, but solid. Fire burned you alive. Ice just suspended you. She realized with a terrifying clarity that freedom was no longer an option on the table. The only choice left was which cage she would die in. She took a breath. It was shaky and tasted of bile, but it filled her lungs. She uncurled her fingers from the edge of the desk and stepped away from the door, moving deeper into the room. She moved into his space, into the gravity of the monolith. He will break my legs if I go back, she whispered, the words falling like stones into the silence. He will make sure I never run again. Hyun-Yu didn't blink. He waited for the verdict. Melissa looked up at him, her eyes wide and dry. With the panic hardening into a desperate, jagged resolve, she surrendered. She handed over the invisible keys to her life, placing them in the palm of the man who had sworn vengeance on her bloodline. I am not his daughter, she said, her voice trembling but clear. Not anymore. She took one final step forward, crossing the invisible line he had drawn on the floor. Don't let them take me. Hyun-Yu accepted her surrender with a single sharp nod. There was no triumph in his eyes, only the cold calculation of a general accepting the burden of a new front line. He didn't waste time with reassurances. He simply reached under the lip of his heavy mahogany desk and pressed a recessed switch that had not been touched in 5 years. The reaction was immediate and visceral. A deep, subterranean rumble vibrated through the floorboards. It felt more in the bones than hurt in the ears. Then came the sound of heavy hydraulics engaging, a pneumatic hiss that cut through the silence of the room. Above the floor-to-ceiling windows, concealed panels in the ceiling retracted, and sheets of reinforced ballistic steel began to descend. Melissa watched in stunned silence as the view of the city, the rain, the lights, the dark abyss where her father's men waited, was slowly erased. The shutters moved with the unstoppable weight of a guillotine blade. Inch by inch, the world was walled out. The gray twilight of the storm was choked off, replaced by the harsh, clinical hum of the emergency lighting. Clang. The steel plates hit the floor tracks with a sound like a vault door ceiling. The office was instantly severed from the rest of reality. The sound of the rain vanished. The city was gone. The monolith had closed its eyes, transforming the executive suite from a penthouse into a bunker. The air in the room seemed to thicken, recycled now, heavy with the scent of ozone and enclosed space. Melissa looked around, her breathing shallow. The walls felt closer. The luxury of the office, the leather, the wood, the art, suddenly felt like furniture in a tomb. She was safe from the fire outside, but she was locked in the ice inside. Yanyu stood in the center of the artificial light, looking more at home in the steel box than he ever had against the backdrop of the sky. He adjusted his cuffs, his demeanor shifting from negotiator to warden. He pointed a finger at the black leather chair opposite his desk. "Sit," he commanded. It wasn't an invitation. It was the first order of her new life. On him, Melissa hesitated for a fraction of a second, the instinct to flee flaring one last time. But she looked at the wall of solid steel covering the window. There was nowhere to run. She walked on legs that felt like water and sank into the chair, gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned white. She was property now, and property stayed where it was put. The silence inside the steel-reinforced room was absolute, a heavy, pressurized vacuum that made the blood rushing in Melissa's ears sound like a roar. Then the phone on the desk rang. It wasn't the frantic, chirping ring of a cell phone. It was the low, steady trill of the secure landline, a direct link to the security desk in the lobby. Yanyu didn't snatch it up. He let it ring twice, 3 times, watching Melissa flinch with every pulse of sound. But he wanted her to understand exactly how thin the line was between her safety and her destruction. Finally, he reached out and pressed the speakerphone button. He didn't lift the receiver. "Song?" he said. "Mr. Song." A voice crackled through the speaker. It was smooth, polite, and terrifyingly familiar. It wasn't the voice of a thug. It was the voice of a bureaucrat who specialized in violence. Melissa's hands clamped over her mouth to stifle a scream. She knew that voice. It was Director Choi, her father's right hand, the man who had personally dragged her back from the airport the first time she tried to run when she was 16. "This is Director Choi of the Yang Corporation," the voice continued, calm as a funeral director. "I apologize for the disruption to your business this evening. Ikuri Honik, we are currently in your lobby." "I see that," Hyunyu replied, leaning back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "My security chief tells me you have blocked my exits. In my neighborhood, Director, that is considered an act of aggression." "A precaution only," Choi said. "We have traced a stolen asset to this building. A young woman. She entered the premises this morning and has not left. We believe she is currently on the executive floor." "Stolen asset," Hyun-Yu repeated, testing the words. He looked at Melissa, huddled in the chair, shivering. "She is mentally unwell, Mr. Song," Choi lied effortlessly. "She is prone to hysteria and theft. The chairman is very concerned for her safety. He has sent us to bring her home for treatment." The euphemism hung in the air like poison gas. Treatment. Melissa closed her eyes, tears leaking out. The treatment meant isolation rooms and sedatives. "I have 1,000 employees," Hyun-Yu said, his voice bored. "I don't keep track of their mental health." "We know she is in your office," Choi's voice hardened, losing its veneer of politeness. "We tracked her phone to your desk before the signal died. We are not asking you to get involved, Mr. Song. We are simply asking you to open the elevator. Send her down. We will take her off your hands and your windows will remain intact." Hyun-Yu looked at the phone, then at the woman trembling in the chair. The offer was simple. Trade the girl for peace. It was the logical, business-like thing to do. "You want the girl," Hyun-Yu stated flatly. "We want the daughter," Choi corrected. "Send her down, now." Hyun-Yu stared at the speakerphone, his expression hardening into something brittle and dangerous. The logic of the situation demanded compliance. Hand over the liability, avoid the war, return to business. That was how the Song Syndicate had survived for 15 years, by being colder and smarter than the rest. But the voice of Director Choi, smug, entitled, assuming obedience, ignited a fire in Hyun Yu's gut that logic couldn't extinguish. It was the same entitlement that had burned his parents' house. It was the assumption that the Yangs could take whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and the world would simply roll over. Hyun Yu looked at Melissa. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at her hands, resigned to the inevitable betrayal. She expected him to sell her. Why wouldn't he? He leaned forward, bringing his face close to the speaker. Director Choi, Hyun Yu said softly. You seem to be operating under a misconception. And what is that? Choi asked, impatience creeping into his tone. You think this is a negotiation? Hyun Yu's voice dropped, becoming a low, vibrating growl. You breached my perimeter. You threatened my staff. And now you demand I run errands for a man who hasn't had the courage to look me in the eye since 2011. Melissa's head snapped up. She stared at him, stunned. The woman you are looking for is not here, Hyun Yu lied. It was a blatant, impossible lie, delivered with the weight of a sledgehammer. And even if she were, I would not hand a stray dog over to a butcher like Jang Seok-ju, let alone a human being. Mr. Song, Choi warned, his voice icy, be very careful. We have 50 men within a 2-block radius. Do not start a war over a runaway girl. I'm not starting a war, Choi, Hyun Yu replied, his eyes blazing with a dark, terrifying exhilaration. I'm finishing one. He reached out and slammed his hand down on the receiver, severing the connection with a violence that made Melissa jump. The line went dead. The silence that followed was electric. Hyun Yu stood up, buttoning his jacket with sharp, jerky movements. He had done it. He had just declared war on the most powerful crime syndicate in the country. He had thrown away 15 years of peace for a woman he didn't even like. He looked at Melissa, his chest heaving slightly. You are not going down there, he said, his voice rough. So get up. If they want you, they are going to have to climb 40 floors of hell to get you. The red light on the desk phone died. Tershwani, but the room didn't return to peace. It vibrated with the aftermath of the declaration. The silence now wasn't empty. It was pregnant, waiting for the inevitable counterstroke. It came 40 seconds later. On the wall panel, the elevator indicators, usually a soothing cascade of floor numbers, flashed a synchronized, angry crimson. Override attempt. They are hacking the lift controls, Hyun Yu noted, his voice devoid of alarm. He walked to the wall of monitors, his back to the trembling woman. Predictable? Then came the sound. It wasn't the cinematic roar of gunfire that movies promised. Filtered through 40 floors of reinforced concrete and steel, it was a dull, rhythmic popping, like a heavy staple gun being fired into a wet mattress. Thud, thud, thud. Crack. Melissa convulsed. The sound hit her physically. She curled into the leather chair, her knees pulling to her chest, her hands clapping over her ears to shut out the noise of the violence being waged in her name. She had heard that sound before, echoing from the firing range on her father's estate, usually followed by the disappearance of a staff member. It was the soundtrack of the Jang legacy. They're shooting, she sobbed, the words muffled against her knees. They're going to come up. They always come up. Hyun Yu didn't flinch. He didn't even look toward the door. He stood perfectly still, his eyes tracking the security readouts on the wall. He watched the biometric vitals of his security team on the lobby level fluctuate, heart rate spiking, positions shifting. He saw Sector 4 go dark, a casualty. He noted it with a grim tightening of his jaw, but his hands remained at his sides, relaxed and lethal. They are not coming up, Hyun Yu corrected her, his voice cutting through her panic like a cold draft. They are caught in the fatal funnel of the main atrium. My men have the high ground on the mezzanine. Another vibration shuddered through the floorboards, heavier this time, perhaps a breaching charge on the stairwell door. The coffee cup on the desk rattled against its saucer. Melissa whimpered, burying her face deeper into her arms, trying to make herself small enough to disappear. Hyun Yu merely glanced at the rattling cup, annoyed by the vibration, not the violence. To her, this was the apocalypse. To him, it was simply mechanics. He had designed the lobby for exactly this scenario. a kill box disguised as corporate luxury. He watched the red dots on the screen stall, then falter. Or the monolith was doing exactly what he had built it to do: bleed the enemy dry before they ever reached the throne room. The gunfire ceased as abruptly as a switch being flipped. The rhythmic thudding against the lower blast doors stopped, leaving a ringing silence that felt louder than the noise. Melissa stayed curled in the chair, her hands clamped over her ears, eyes squeezed shut. She was waiting for the explosion. She was waiting for the elevator doors to ping open and the men in charcoal raincoats to drag her out by her hair. But the explosion didn't come. Instead, a new sound drifted up from the street level, muffled by the steel shutters but unmistakable on the audio feed Yeon-yu was monitoring. Sirens, a chorus of them, wailing in the distance, growing louder with every second. Aram, the flashing blue lights of the city police began to bleed into the edges of the perimeter cameras. Mr. Song, Park's voice returned over the intercom, breathless but controlled. They are disengaging. They hear the sirens. They're pulling back. Yeon-yu watched the screens. On the monitors, the black SUVs were already moving. The men in the lobby didn't run. They retreated with professional discipline. They dragged two of their own who were limping, collected their spent brass casings, and vanished into the waiting vehicles. It took less than 40 seconds. By the time the first police cruiser rounded the corner, the SUVs were nothing more than taillights fading into the rainy night. "Let them go," Yeon-yu ordered. "Do not engage the police. Wipe the lobby tapes. We had a security system malfunction. Nothing more." "Understood." "Ah, sir." Yeon-yu cut the feed. He stood in the silent office, the adrenaline slowly metabolizing into a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He knew why they had left. The Zhang Syndicate didn't fear him, but they feared exposure. A gunfight in a private lobby was a problem they could bury. A siege involving the police force was a scandal that froze bank accounts. They had done the math, and the math said to fold. For tonight. "They're gone," Yeon-yu said, speaking to the ball of misery in the leather chair. Melissa lowered her hands slowly, blinking in the harsh, artificial light. She looked at the elevator, then at him, her face pale and streaked with tears. "They left," she whispered, disbelief trembling in her voice. "My father never stops. He never just leaves." "He didn't stop," Yeon-yu corrected her, walking back to his desk. He calculated the cost. He realized he couldn't take the tower without burning down the city, so he decided to wait. He looked at the steel shutters blocking the view of the retreating enemy. He could feel the weight of the promise they had left behind. They hadn't retreated in defeat. They had retreated to sharpen their knives. "He will be back," Yeon-yu said, his voice grim. "And next time, he won't knock." Yeon-yu reached under the desk one final time. With a hiss of hydraulics, the heavy steel shutters began to ascend, peeling back the metal eyelid of the monolith to reveal the city once more. The view hadn't changed. The rain was still falling in sheets, smearing the lights of the skyline into a neon blur. The traffic below flowed in its usual river of red and white. The world had moved on, indifferent to the siege that had just taken place. But inside the room, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. The air felt thinner, sharper. Yeon-yu walked to the edge of the desk where Melissa's employee ID badge lay, a small rectangle of plastic that identified her as Melissa Johnson, senior architect. He picked it up, studying the photo of the woman who had tried so hard to be invisible. "This is a good forgery," he noted, his voice flat, "but it is no longer necessary." He walked to the sleek metal wastebasket in the corner and dropped the badge. It hit the bottom with a hollow clatter, discarding 10 years of carefully constructed survival in a single second. Melissa watched it fall, a fresh wave of panic rising in her throat. That's my name. That's who I am." "No," Yeon-yu corrected her, turning back to face her. Melissa Johnson was a liability. She was weak, she was frightened, and as of tonight, she is dead. He stepped closer, the distance between them charged with the strange, terrible intimacy of captor and captive. "You are Yang Mi. You are the currency your father used to buy his empire. And since he destroyed mine, I am seizing his assets." He gestured to the glass walls that surrounded them, the cage that looked like a palace. From this moment on, you do not leave this building. You do not step outside for coffee. You do not go home to your apartment. You sleep in the guest suite on the 40th floor. You eat what I give you. You breathe the air I filter. Melissa trembled, the reality of the prison walls closing in. For how long? Until the debt is paid, Yu replied. Or until your father burns this city down to get you back. Whichever comes first. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer a promise of safety. He simply offered the terms of her existence. He walked back to his leather chair and sat down, buttoning his jacket with the casual grace of a man returning to business as usual. He picked up the stack of blueprints, the Shibuya project, and slid them across the mahogany surface toward her. The structural load calculations are still incorrect, he said, not looking up. Fix them. Get back to work.